I've worked with a lot of founding teams who could see exactly what was going wrong in their co-founder partnership, but they still couldn't change it. And the reasons why matter more than most people realize. See, there's a real gap between knowing what the problem is and being able to fix it, right? And I'm going to show you exactly why. Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Jones. I'm a licensed psychologist, and for the last 6 years, I've worked exclusively with startup co-founding teams. And here's what I keep seeing. It's the co-founder relationship that is the single most important relationship in business, and it's the one that nobody pays attention to until it's too late. And so I help co-founding teams fix that before it costs them the company. See, many teams do come into my office with a high degree of self-awareness. They can tell me the moment the dynamic started to shift, and they can name some of the patterns that keep repeating, but they still can't get out of it on their own. Most often, that's not due to some inherent flaw or weakness. It's actually just the predictable outcome of specific factors that most founders have never really had to develop a framework for. And the way I think about it, there are five individual factors that make co-founders more vulnerable to staying stuck. And then there's three group level dynamics that make it even worse. And once you can see and understand both, the complexity of this problem looks completely different. So let's start with the individual factors. Number one, poor stress management. So founding, as you know, is one of the most sustained high stress environments in all of professional life, right? There's no off switch. There's no defined end to the day. And those financial stakes, along with your personal identity development, really compound. And so it creates this chronic stress that burns the exact resources mentally and emotionally and physically that effective conflict resolution require. So then things like perspective taking, emotional regulation, the ability to hold two or more competing truths at one time, like most founders are already running at their absolute capacity, which means that when the co-founder relationship goes sideways, they're trying to navigate it with depleted resources. And that predictably doesn't go so well. Number two, imposter syndrome. So this shows up for many of the founders I work with. And it's not because founders themselves tend to be an insecure bunch, usually the opposite, but mainly because founding is such an uncertain situation, a real grappling with, existential themes of, death, anxiety, mortality, and you're operating at the edge of your competence consistently. In more often in a domain where there's no clear immediate feedback loop or feedback loops that take a long time to develop, and you're building something that fundamentally has never existed before. So of course that situation creates some self-doubt. And self-doubt shows up in relational conflicts as defensiveness because you're trying to maintain your identity, your sense of inner worth, your self-esteem, and that already feels under attack. So there can be this quiet fear that, if I back down on this, if I fail, then I'm going to prove that I'm not capable. And so I lose the ability to then tell the difference between what's right and what's self-protective because you're constantly trying to prove your worth. So three, perfectionism. In founder perfectionism, it usually looks just like high standards, right? But in conflict, it shows up as the inability to be wrong. So then repair takes far longer because a healthy repair involves some sort of acknowledgement like, yeah, I got that wrong. Or I see how that landed for you and I could understand why that'd be difficult. And for someone with perfectionist tendencies, those types of sentences can feel like a catastrophic blow to their self-perception. And so it doesn't get said. And without it, repair doesn't really happen. It just sort of reverberates and echoes. I'm working with a founder right now who has an insanely high inner critic. And the amount of pressure that shows up for this person and every single decision is getting second guessed. Every single move is getting critiqued to such an extent that it impacts not only his relationship with himself and his ability to perform at the level he would like to, but it also impacts every single individual with whom he manages and he talks to. And so this level of perfectionism is actually detrimental to performance, and it happens all the time, and it does contribute to more challenging interpersonal dynamics. Four, failure to scale. Now, this one shows up more often in non-CEO founders because there's a degree of isolation that takes place. See, where the CEO role is constantly being demanded to grow, to expand, to have co-founder level, founder level insight, as well as this kind of operational, interdisciplinary, multiple systems, multiple department type of perspective, as a company starts to grow, the non-CEO founder tends to get a little bit more isolated and isn't exposed to the same external sources of growth and relationships that CEOs are. And so they then get forced and kind of pigeonholed into an IC, individual contributor type performance at the expense of growing as a leader and a manager. And so then when that happens, if that non-CEO founder doesn't seek out those additional growth opportunities in order to keep pace as the company grows, then they keep operating, I guess, from this place that from like a model that's out of date. That the company has already outgrown, and so then their co-founder notices that friction and sees it, and usually has a lot of internal distress, trying to figure out if they need to fire their co-founder, or restructure roles and responsibilities, or adjust equity and compensation, because they fundamentally sense that a change needs to happen because their performance is not on par. And they really fear damaging the relationship through direct feedback. So if they give it, sometimes it's not really received well. And that failure to scale then can be really, really tricky to navigate on your own. 5, personality differences. And I do want to give a little bit of a disclaimer on this one, because personality is sort of this ad hoc justification where, retrospectively, co-founders will say, oh, we're not a good fit because we're just such different people. And it's usually not the actual cause. It's just a shorthand way to scapegoat individuals rather than identify the dysfunctional system that both co-founders are co-creating, right? And so because, in truth, different working styles and risk tolerances and those kinds of things, they're not inherently incompatible. What makes them incompatible is the absence of a shared language for that difference and being able to navigate those differences to lead to greater effectiveness, right? And so when you don't have that shared language and those frameworks to contain conflict and make it something more productive than either of you would get to on your own, then they start developing into these like character judgments, right? So like the analytical founder, as an example of this, starts seeing the more intuitive founder as kind of reckless or disconnected, head in the clouds. And then that intuitive founder starts seeing the more analytical founder as pessimistic and constrained. And both feel true. Both of these narratives feel true, but neither one is actually fair. Like neither one is perceiving the system as a whole. And I guess like speaking of the system as a whole, let's shift from the individual dynamics to now the group dynamics. The first one here is multiple relationships. So Noam Wasserman wrote a book called The Founder's Dilemmas, and his research out of Harvard was really helpful. And part of what he discovered was that every single additional social tie between co-founders, so like friends who started a company together, family members, romantic partners, each of those increased the probability of co-founder departure by up to 30%. Think about that. So every single one of those social ties adds like weight and pressure to a structure or a foundation that's already under strain. So that equity conversation that you might be wanting to have now has a friendship dynamic attached to it. And the conversation about restructuring roles now has like this family history and family power dynamics underneath it, right? So then nothing about this relationship, whenever it has those additional pieces to it, stays simple. And it makes it far more difficult to disentangle the conflict on your own because of it. The second piece here is, these debates of recognition. So who gets named in the press? Who does the team go to under pressure? And who does the investor address first in the room, right? Like these contribution maps inside a founding team are almost never symmetrical. And recognition is often disproportionate. It doesn't always reflect the equity structure or the roles and responsibilities themselves. And those mismatches between the visibility and work and the roles, it accumulates really quietly at first. But when people don't feel seen and valued for their contributions, resentment is kind of inevitable. Right? And when there's emotional debt that compounds over time and is calcified into resentment, of course, it's going to be harder to disentangle on your own. The third piece here on this group process is arguments of closeness. So how close should we be? Right? This sounds like this made up, soft, touchy-feely type of question, but it really creates some of the most persistent conflict I see. Because one co-founder might want a best friend level partnership, right? Where there's checking in more consistently, some emotional attunement, some meaningful emotional investment in one another's lives, that kind of a thing. Whereas the other really wants a clean, high trust, professional relationship where there's like respect and alignment and, effectiveness and maybe even limited personal involvement, maybe wanting some space. And neither of these preferences is inherently wrong, but whenever they are mismatched and unspoken rather than made explicit, it creates a underlying friction that neither founder knows how to name on their own. I'm thinking about there's a psychoanalyst named Dix from 1967 is a book that I'm thinking of. And he talks about these unconscious agreements between marital partners. The way that I've seen this play out, just to give you an example, is I worked with a leadership team where they came to me because it was the CEO and the CTO. They came to me and they said, Matt, we have a low ownership executive team. And the way that this shows up is when there's a crisis, they disengage. They don't come to the plate with solutions or clear problem solving. They kind of just look to us to figure it out. And I kind of posed the question to them quite directly. I said, What have been your contributions to this system? How have you co-constructed it?" And all of a sudden the CTO says, "Oh, Matt, I realize that every single time there's been a crisis, the CEO has put on the hero cape and he's figured it out for us. And he's kind of laid out the plan and we've gone and executed it. And so I'm now realizing we've created this dependency and this tendency in the team to lean out instead of leaning in during these difficult moments. And so this team codified this as the formula hero mode equals failure mode because it's so unequivocally clear that they created this dysfunction in the executive team by rescuing it. And so now instead of coming in with certainty and like a pre-formulated, well thought out example of how to proceed, what they do now is they lean into the problem and they encourage people to lean into it with them. They hold space for that uncertainty, for that grappling with discomfort, and they empower them to solve the problems individually and then bring those to the group for further discussion. And so as I kind of put this back together, that like part of what can be so difficult are those unspoken emotional dynamics between team members. And a big part of the work that I do with teams is uncovering things like these arguments of closeness and making them more explicit so that material can be worked with. So here's the thread that connects all eight of these. They all get worse under pressure. And the startup environment obviously doesn't just like fail to help founders manage those dynamics, period, full stop, because they lack resources. It actively amplifies them. High stress, limited sleep, compressed timelines, like all of these enormous personal and professional stakes. All of that eats into the exact resources that you need to navigate this with a clear head. And so that's why a lot of the advice of, just talk it out, guys, doesn't really work for teams who are genuinely stuck, right? You'll power through like one long conversation and then you'll realize that those agreements didn't hold, right? And you'll find yourself either in another circular debate or issue, or you'll just realize, oh, we have the conversation. It's really hard, takes a lot of time, energy, and effort. And then nothing changes. We find ourselves back to the same exact position. And so that's why most advice is ultimately problematic because it assumes like a level of emotional bandwidth and safety and skill that most founders who are in active conflict don't have available. Right? Like when your nervous system is on edge and your emotional resources are so depleted, doing any type of deep interpersonal process work that's actually needed for you to repair is exceptionally difficult to do on your own. But in seeing these eight factors, my hope is that that gives you a starting point, right? And then the next is to actually reach out to a co-founder coach who can help you. So your co-founder relationship is far too important to leave to chance. So subscribe, grab the co-founder effect below, and I'll show you exactly what to do with it.